Welcome back to our series of videos on material fallacies. This will be the third and final video of this series. In this video, we will look at fallacies of induction as well as a couple of other different classes of fallacies. If you remember, an inductive argument is one that tries to draw a conclusion from various particular pieces of evidence. In other words, induction is a mode of reasoning that generalizes from particular instances. Normally, induction is a perfectly legitimate and sound way of reasoning. If I observe 100 white swans, then it is a perfectly sound conclusion to draw that swans are white. This is only probable, but it is highly probable. Nevertheless, you can have a fallacy when you make a hasty generalization. That is to say, when you simply make a general statement from only a very small sample. So, for example, I could go to the Phillies and they could lose the game, and I then could conclude incorrectly that the Phillies are having a horrible season. This is when you generalize from a very insufficient body of evidence. This is hasty generalization. The second fallacy on this list is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which literally means after this, therefore because of this, or this is often called the false cause fallacy. This is a fallacy which simply draws a fallacious causal inference from two separate events. Every time I take my car out to wash it, it rains. I conclude, therefore, that taking my car out of the garage causes it to rain. This obviously is a false conclusion. And yet, as I pointed out in our web conferences, this can take much subtler and more deceiving forms. And as I mentioned, often this happens in analyzing statistical evidence, where a correlation is automatically assumed to be a causal relationship when we don't know. Sometimes there can be a very suggestive correlation between two events, but further study is necessary. C, hypothesis contrary to fact. This is when we make an assumption based on something that did not happen. If only I had concluded this business deal, I would be a rich man. The fact is, we don't know. The business deal actually could have been a failure. I could have gone bankrupt from that deal. We just don't know. Another case of fallacious induction is false analogy, when we make a false analogy between two different things. Right? Peter Kreeft, for example, points to a statement by Francis Bacon where he compares war to bodily health, where civil war is like an internal fever, whereas foreign wars are like proper and healthy exercise. This is a dubious analogy at best. E, argument from silence. This is actually also a common fallacy, where we simply conclude from the silence of an author or of a person something that is unwarranted. So, for example, an author never mentions having a husband or children. So we conclude that she was never married and never had children. We don't know, actually. She could very well have had a husband and had children, but she just never wrote about them, right? Or never mentioned them, or the writings about them maybe were lost. So this is something that we cannot conclude, right? But also too, people do this all the time. The Bible says nothing about X or Y, therefore the Bible approves of it or disapproves of it. Again, this is a fallacious argument. Maybe that's the case, but we have to look at other evidence. Simply because something says nothing about it doesn't necessarily mean that it approves or disapproves of whatever you're trying to prove. F, selective evidence or special pleading. This is a fallacy that is very common, particularly among historians of a particular, sometimes of a particular ideological or political bent. So, for example, conservative historians tend to glorify the past or give a positive evaluation of the past, and therefore they ignore evidence of past injustices or wrongdoing, but also so-called progressive or radical historians, it is in their interest to paint the past as black as possible, to portray it as evil and as so full of injustices that, thank God, we've now progressed beyond that. And so what they do is that they only highlight instances of injustice and don't mention or highlight things that might be more positive. And of course, this is what happens too in journalism, depending on one's political persuasion, where certain evidence is highlighted that supports your argument, but evidence that doesn't is ignored or downplayed. And so one always has to be very careful in reading, for example, newspapers or websites, because in many ways fake news really has nothing to do with necessarily false information, but with a narrative that's being promoted. And so evidence that supports that narrative, of course, is highlighted, whereas evidence that doesn't is ignored or downplayed. So one has to be very careful as to what narrative that particular article or website or newspaper or source is trying to promote. And then there is slanting the question, which of course is kind of sort of like complex question, and it's very similar to slanting in the earlier example. So, for example, don't you think people are entitled to basic health care? Well, yes, of course. But of course, then the question is, well, how do we get people basic health care? And so forth. So this is another example of a fallacy of induction. The next group are procedural fallacies. These fallacies ignore the context or procedures for making an argument. I won't spend much time on these. I know Krefft includes them in here, although these actually are not as common, or they can be included under other fallacies. But I'll just go through them very quickly for the sake of completeness. These are refuting an argument by refuting its conclusion, assuming that refuting an argument disproves its conclusion, ignoring an argument, substituting explanations for proof, answering another argument than the one given, shifting the burden of proof, winning the argument but losing the arguer, or vice versa. I just simply ask you to read what Krefft has to say about these, but I will say that none of these will appear on the quiz. But I certainly would encourage you to read what Krefft has to say about it. Although letter F, I think, is of all of these the most interesting, and it does occur, shifting the burden of proof, which is that when you make an extraordinary claim, you need extraordinary evidence. And in many ways, usually the more ordinary explanation is the truer one, which is goes to another principle called Occam's razor, which we could discuss at another point. The final group of fallacies are metaphysical fallacies. These are mistakes in reasoning usually made in talking about the nature of reality. They are far more common than you might think, and that's why I do want to actually spend some time on these fallacies. These are reductionism, or nothing buttery, nothing butness. Be very careful when people say that we are nothing but our genes, or we're nothing but our programming, or we're nothing but our environment, and so forth and so on. This indicates already a reductionist type of thinking, which that is, it reduces us to a lower level, or reduces reality to a lower level that we can measure or comprehend. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're understanding the whole phenomenon. Certainly, human beings are influenced by their environment and by their genes, but not entirely. We are more than just simply our physical or social makeup, and I think experience bears this out. But nevertheless, this reductionism is very common today. We are nothing but our brains. Right? The mind is nothing but the brain. Well, actually, there are very serious problems with that statement, and so forth. The fallacy of accident, which is confusing the accidental with the essential. I think we had an example of this in the exercises. Nietzsche is a philosopher whom we should reject because he was a moral reprobate who went insane towards the end of his life. That's an ad hominem, but also it can be a fallacy of accident in the sense that whatever Nietzsche's moral failings and whatever his mental health, that is accidental. It's not essential to the truth of his thought. or at least the cogency of his thought. Confusing quantity with quality. This is also a very common fallacy. It's a big book, therefore it must be important. That is, of course, fallacious. There are lots of very, very large books that are actually not particularly important or interesting. There are some very profound philosophical books that are very short and therefore very important and influential. So just because, for example, a book is big and long doesn't necessarily mean it is better, and vice versa. And this, of course, applies to other things too. Well, to the significance of human beings in the universe. Just because we're a small part of the universe does not necessarily mean we are insignificant, for example. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that is confusing the abstract and the concrete. You can read Krefft on this. I won't go into this too much in this video. There won't be an example of this on the quizzes. Confusing the logical, psychological, and physical because. Now, this is actually an important and common fallacy. We often assume that something is wrong because of psychological reasons. And so you believe in God because you need a father figure, for example. This is simply confusing the psychological cause. Certainly people are, actually psychological studies show that people are predisposed to believing in God who have had a good parent, a good father particularly, but also the opposite is true. Right? People are inclined not to believe in God who have an absent or weak or abusive father, for example. Right? This tells you nothing about the existence of God or not. The psychological reasons for believing in God are interesting and important, but they do not prove or disprove the existence of God. Right? Same thing with political viewpoints. Right? There might be psychological reasons, and actually there are, that have been why one is a liberal or a conservative, a Democrat or Republican, but this tells you nothing about whether the policies of either party are good or true or cogent. The other two fallacies here, I will leave you to study in Krefft: the existential fallacy, confusing essence and existence, and confusing the natural with the common. Okay. But so far, the ones that I have spent some time on are what I think are the most common and important fallacies. So this concludes our third and final installment on material fallacies. Thank you.